You've been a big fan of Ron Paul. Can you explain what you admire about him?
A big fan is an understatement. I think Ron Paul is like the greatest living American hero. I revere him on the level of the founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson or George Washington. Number one, I mean, all of the major issues that he was correct in his understanding of them, his diagnosis of what caused these problems, and his solutions. And in hindsight, there's just like a million different examples of where almost everybody today would agree, even though his ideas were very controversial at the time, be like, oh my God, if we had just listened to Ron Paul about that, we'd be so much better off. But I think there's something almost deeper than that about why Ron Paul inspires so much love from so many people is okay. So number one, the guy, he was a champion of these views for decades when there was no payoff for it at all, where he was just kind of alone in the woods being, they used to call him Dr. No because, well, he was a medical doctor. And then he would be the lone no vote in Congress, like all the time, like on the bills that the entire Congress, bipartisan agreement, everything is, and there's one vote against it, and that he would be that guy. He clearly kept doing what he was doing simply because he believed it was right, not because there was any benefit for him. In fact, he dealt with a lot of headaches for the views that he had. And then he was just a genuine person of integrity. He's the only congressman who I've ever heard this about, and like DC insiders, people on the Hill will say this. He was the only congressman of my lifetime who the lobbyists simply stopped visiting. He was the only one who they just stopped going to his office because they were just like, there's just no getting through to this guy. He was just not playing politics like that. And he was, you imagine what it must have been like from like the lobbyist perspective when they first tried to go there, and they'd be like, all right, listen, we really need you to, vote yes on this or that. And he was like, the Constitution doesn't authorize us to do that. And they're like, what? Like who in this town even talks like that, And so there was he's also I've met him many times at this point, and he is just genuinely, he's like one of those guys who's just from like an older, better generation. Just he's the sweetest guy, but he's like but he's not a pushover. Like he was a tough guy in his day, and he was an athlete, and he was in the Air Force, and is married to the same woman for I think over 60 years at this point, has like a big, beautiful family. He was a country doctor. He was a baby doctor who delivered thousands of babies. Like he's like this kind of classic American figure. And I just think at the risk of falling into like hero worship or something like that, I do think he's a genuinely great man, and I think great men are to be revered.
Yeah, as you said, there's integrity there. Can you speak to the ideas that Ron Paul represents? Like you said, some of the things he's been right about. Maybe can you speak about the economics, the Fed, and maybe war, and being anti-military intervention?
Well, I think it all came from kind of the same central thesis, which is that the highest political value ought to be liberty. And that, the government by its very nature is an instrument of force and tyranny, and that therefore the more government you have, the less liberty you have. I think he was way ahead of his time in like really calling out the corruption in DC. And I think that's one of the things that's that it's a common through line between the Federal Reserve and government spending, and of course this crazy war industry that our country has. There's a lot of components to that, but essentially Ron Paul was talking about draining the swamp way before it was like this dominant mass message. And I think Ron Paul in many ways laid the groundwork in his 2008 and 2012 presidential campaigns for not saying that he leads to Donald Trump, but he laid the groundwork for Donald Trump to be able to get up at the South Carolina Republican primary debate and look at Jeb Bush and say, your brother lied us into war. And you know what I mean? And to have the Republicans agree with him, these were a lot of the same people who had voted for George W. Bush twice and supported the war and even mocked their liberal, fellow countrymen for not being on board with it. And a lot of that was the work that Ron Paul did and people waking up to the how messed up all these wars were. And I think that at least from there were a couple major things for me, okay, at the time. So I was a young man when I first found Ron Paul. I was in 2007 was when I first saw him and then started obsessively reading all of his books. And so I was young. I'm born in 83. So what would that make me? 23, 24 when I first found him. So I was a young guy. And at least for me at the time, there were like kind of two categories in my, naive mind where, okay, there were like the liberals who supported big government at home, but were skeptical about, big government abroad, or they're skeptical about wars. And then there were the conservatives who said that they supported small government, limited government at home, but were always on the side of whatever the next war is. And at least for me, and I think for a lot of people of my generation, Ron Paul was the first guy who came along and said, like, no, I'm for limited government here and abroad. And it was kind of like a portal where you could like access a different perspective on the world. And then once you saw that, you were like, wait, that's actually what makes sense. It doesn't make sense to like, what is it exactly that like all the Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush and even like Milton Friedman and guys like that and Thomas Sowell and it's like you want a constitutionally limited world empire? Like that's what you guys stand for? Because that doesn't fit together at all. And so why is it that we were taking this as a given? And then of course, the more you look into it, you realize that like, okay, those two things do make sense together. And then also that kind of like in the initial wave of like the original progressives, look, people like Woodrow Wilson or FDR, these were people who were pushing big government at home and big government abroad. And that actually made much more sense as a cohesive worldview. And to oppose that would be the Ron Paul worldview. And then the other thing for me, and this was my introduction to Ron Paul. And this too, to me, was like kind of a portal in a way. It was a way, at least in my naive, not fully functioned brain or fully developed brain at 24 years old or whatever. It was a way for me to kind of get like I tapped into something that was outside the empire. And I had heard a lot, I was already against George W. Bush and I didn't like the war. I had already figured out, I think this war in Iraq is bullshit. And I think that we were lied into it. And so I kind of got that. And then there were liberals and left-wingers who I knew. I grew up in New York City, so I was very familiar with the left-wing perspective, and who were critical of George W. Bush and for fighting the war and signing the Patriot Act into law and things like that. But I had never really heard anybody break it down the way Ron Paul did when he basically was like, look, there's a reason why these terrorists hate us. And it's not what they're telling you. They don't hate us for our freedom. It's not as if, I remember the way Pat Buchanan put it, which I always loved, was he goes, he said, Dick Cheney makes it sound like Osama bin Laden stumbled on, like in the deserts of Afghanistan, he stumbled onto a copy of our Bill of Rights somewhere. And he was like, oh my God, they're free to look at this speedy trial. Are you kidding me? Like, this is like, what is going on here? They can own guns and their women can wear mini skirts, and that just made people so angry that they were ready to, like suicide bomb themselves. And like, that makes no sense at all. And then Ron Paul was just like, no, look, here's the thing. If we think we can just go around the world killing people, propping up dictatorships, putting our military bases in the Muslims' holy land, and not engender hatred from that, then we do that at our own peril. And I thought it was such an interesting kind of, it had always been, I'm an 80s and 90s kid. And to me, it was always kind of a given that like America's number one, we're the force for good in the world. And it was like an interesting introduction to the idea that there are people outside of that who are dominated by that, who don't care for it very much. And like that's what 9/11 was actually about. And for me, I was living in New York City. I was 18, I think, when 9/11 happened. And that was like the moment of my childhood. It was a huge thing to live through. I mean, we were attacked. This seemed like something that could only happen in a history book. That didn't happen to America in the 90s. 2001 was basically the 90s. And it was just like, oh, finally it clicked. It was like, that makes sense. It's the first time I had ever heard like an explanation and an understanding of this whole thing that we're involved in now, from 9/11 to the terror wars, that actually just made perfect sense.